Ready to go live? Okay, we're ready. Okay, welcome everybody. This is the very first class of hopefully an ongoing Tanya share. I'm very excited to begin. I'm also very humbled to begin. I did teach Tanya a number of years ago to high school students, and I feel like a decade later, I'm more fully understanding the immensity of what it means to actually teach Tanya. But the Rebbe always said many a time, if you know Aleph, teach Aleph. So I am humbly going to teach you what I have learned myself. And I'm really looking at this as a journey that we're going to explore together. So if you have questions, if you have examples, if you can somehow fine tune the information that we're bringing here and we could go through it together, I would deeply appreciate it. The way the class is going to look is, although the Tanya is an actual sefer and everything is inside, it's a text-based class. I don't want it to be a text-based class because it's a mom-friendly class, which means that there's going to be noises and there's going to be distractions, and I don't want to add a further stress of looking inside. So I'm going to the best of my ability, explain everything to you outside, and if we can, bring the concepts down so that they are relevant and easy to understand without it getting too technical or complicated. With that being said, today we're not even going to get into the actual sefer. We're just going to kind of step back and give broader context to what the Tanya is, where did it come from, where did it happen? Like for someone who's heard about Tanya and maybe knows how integral it is to, let's say, to the Hasidic way of living our lives, you'd think like maybe it was written 1,000 years ago. Like let's just like find out, where is Tanya from? How did it begin? And from there, we'll kind of dive into what it's about and how it can have an impact on our everyday life, really every single moment of our everyday life. So to start from the very, very beginning, before we even start with the Baal Tanya, who's the person who wrote the Tanya, his name was Shneir Zalman of Liadi. We're going to go back 2 generations to the Baal Shem Tov. Okay, so to just paint the background for what was happening during the time of the Baal Shem Tov. We're talking about the late 17th century, and the Baal Shem Tov was born into a very turbulent time in Jewish history. The Jewish people were basically just kind of getting up out of the trauma that was the Shabtai Tzvi era. So if any of you don't know who Shabtai Tzvi was, he was one of many different people who rose up and said that they are the Messiah, they are a Mashiach, and they led people to do all sorts of things like sell their homes and start moving out to Eretz Yisrael. And then he revealed himself to be a false Messiah, which was absolutely devastating to the Jewish people. Shabtai Tzvi is the most well-known, I would say the most well-known, because he had a tremendous impact on the Jewish people. He was able to perform miracles. He used the name of Hashem in order to do so. And then he publicly converted to Islam in front of Jews and non-Jews alike. And it was absolutely devastating. So people who had sold their homes were literally left penniless. People who were on a high, like really who subscribed to this person and were so excited to greet Mashiach, to greet world peace, right? The whole idea that we've been clinging to, that we're working towards Mashiach, that whole era of everything being good and money growing on trees, and just the idea that everything was going to be taken care of by Hashem, were left with absolutely nothing. And it was very hard for people to recover from that. So not just were the poor people recovering from that, but also the elite scholars were really recovering from that as well. It made everybody very wary of anything new, anything different. And in ways, religious people still live with that trauma. Anything that's a little bit different, that's not exactly black and white, is always scary for us. So it's something to be aware of. So in the Baal Shem Tov's, Baal Shem Tov's times, when he began his movement, it was met with a lot of opposition. But let's just start from what happened. The Baal Shem Tov was a miracle child. He was born to extremely elderly parents. I don't know how much in depth we wanted to go into the story, but his parents performed a very great mitzvah. There was once it was one Shabbos, a man came from, I think he came, I should release this is all from memory, but I think he arrived on the day of Shabbos into their town and daven Shacharis in their shul. And everyone was very upset about this. Why? Because it was obvious, because it was like this small town, it was obvious that he had come from another town, which meant that he had walked Tom Shabbos on Shabbos, right? So this was like almost like blatantly not keeping Shabbos. So everyone was shunning him. No one invited him over for the meal. And Rabbi Elazar, the Baal Shem Tov's father, who at the time they were both childless, his name was Elazar and his wife's name was Sarah, they invited him in, and he was very warm and kind to the stranger, even though he had technically probably performed some sort of avera on Shabbos. And he was extremely kind to him. And after Shabbos, the man revealed himself to be Eliyahu and said, I'm here and I want to give you a bracha that you should have a child. Now, the way the story goes, and for some maybe this is hard to believe, the way the story goes is at that time, Rabbi Elazar and Sarah were extremely old. When they finally had the Baal Shem Tov within the year, Elazar was 100 and Sarah was 90. This is obviously miraculous. They were well into their old age, and quite soon they both passed away. And so the Baal Shem Tov was basically raised by the orphanage of the town. It was kind of like everybody kind of contributed to him, took care of him, but he had every reason to just run wild. Instead, he went into nature and he was constantly davening to Hashem, wandering through nature. His father's parting words were to him, never be afraid of anything. And so he roamed amongst wild animals into the depths of forests without any fear at a very, very young age. And at a young age, he met the Lamed Vav Tzadikim, the hidden Tzadikim of the generation, and he joined them. And he traveled with them for many, many years. Point being, that when he finally decided to reveal himself as a hidden tzaddik, no longer hidden, it was met with a lot of opposition. And his approach to Judaism and to the world was very, very different. So let's talk about how it was different and how this kind of brought into the world the concept of Chassidus and brought into the world eventually the Tanya. So one time the Baal Shem Tov was davening in the field, and he was pouring out his heart to Hashem, and it was a vision. He would be sweating, he would be red, he would be shaking sometimes. His neshama was struggling to stay inside his body. It was literally a vision to behold. And there was Eliyahu who appeared to him at that time and said, "You're trying so hard to daven, but if you listen to," and he named these two people, Aaron Shlomo and his wife, when they just speak to Hashem, their words are echoing in Shemayim. And what Eliyahu was trying to say to the Baal Shem Tov was, you're a great tzaddik, you're incredible, you're trying your hardest with all of your incredible kavanas, your intentions while you're davening to connect to God. Meanwhile, this simple person, Aaron Shlomo, is saying some words of Tehillim, and his words are the ones that are resounding through Shemayim. And the idea is that this simple person, the way that he's davening is much more relevant to God. And the Baal Shem Tov set out to kind of explore, what does that mean? And as he started concentrating on the simple people, he started teaching others how incredible the simple people truly are. And he highlighted a few things about the simplicity of the Jewish people. Now, at that time, there was basically two types of Jews. There was the elite, and they treated themselves as elite, and it wasn't because of material wealth, it was because of their learning. So those who were privileged to be able to learn every day and spend time in the base medrash, they were the elite. And then there were the poor folk who barely knew how to learn at all. Some of them couldn't even read. They would just memorize the Tehillim and just say it every single day just from rote memory. And there was this huge discrepancy between the two. And there was a lot of discord between the two. It was even so much so that they had separate shuls because the elite didn't want to associate with the simple folk who didn't really know much Torah, couldn't even open up a page of Gemara. So there was like this really huge rift in Judaism at that time. And the Baal Shem Tov sought to bring together that rift, create more harmony between the two. And he did so not by belittling the elites who were obviously not having the most beautiful midas if they're shunning a whole part of Klal Yisrael. Instead, he tried to bring up the simple folk. And he did this by explaining to them how special they were, that their simple approach to God was more beautiful than anything else because it wasn't tainted by ego. It was simple faith. It was passionate. It was not complicated. It wasn't about them. It was about God. And he would always travel throughout the lands and travel throughout the villages and ask someone, how is your business doing? How are you doing? And just their simple Baruch Hashem would bring a smile to his face, and he would constantly tell them, continue saying Baruch Hashem. That's what makes Hashem happy. Just that simple thanking Hashem for the very hard lives that they were struggling in, but their simple thanks to Hashem was more precious to God than anything else. Okay, the other two things that he did that also raised some eyebrows was he actually was trying to help Jewish people economically. So he encouraged Jews to move out of the cities and to move into kind of like the suburban areas or the more rural areas outside of the city for many different reasons. First of all, in the city, like we all know, is sinful. There's often more sin in the city. Why? There's more people, and there's just more collaboration of that. And if they moved away from the non-Jews, there would be less temptation, and there would also be more ability to work the land, grow vegetables, be more connected to God in nature. And then there was this other part. There was this other thing that he started doing, which was he actually started sending shluchim. So he would train his students to travel throughout the lands and teach the people who didn't know how to learn. And this was something that was a little bit intimidating to the elite, to the ones who did learn. Why are you bothering with them? They're simple. They don't know anything. They don't have the brain capacity. And that also, again, raised a lot of eyebrows to be sending mulamdim to all the different villages. And instead of like screaming at them at how ignorant they are, he was actually sending people out to teach them Aleph Beis, even when they're in their 40s, 50s, didn't matter, to teach them how special they were and how their way of serving Hashem was special, and also to teach their children. This was very different, and it brought about a lot of opposition. So I don't want to go into the whole opposition, but what's important is when the Baal Tanya actually started speaking the Tanya, because before he actually wrote it, he was speaking it. He was sharing it every Shabbos or every Yom Tif, or he actually started it the day that his grandson was born, that Tzemach Tzedek was born. That day, let me look up the exact day because I think that's relevant. That day, he began saying the Tanya, and he shared the first 3 pakim of Tanya. And after that, he would go through a bunch of different prakim every Shabbos and every Yom Tif or a special day. Now, after he would speak it, people would write it down. And the Alter Rebbe would review it, and then it started getting distributed to all the different shows. The ideas were novel. People really were enjoying these things that the Alter Rebbe was saying. Now, what happened was, slowly but surely, the copies were becoming, the mistakes were happening in the copies. Even though the Chassidim were very careful to make sure that no mistakes would happen, one time there were 2 Chassidim. One's name was Pinchas Reitzis, and the other was Binyamin Klutzker. And they were in a town called Leipzig, which was known to be this place where everybody would sell their goods. It was like the modern day fair. It was like a marketplace, but a very big marketplace. People would travel from very far to sell their wares there. And Binyamin Klutzker and Pinchas Reitzis are walking through, and they actually see someone selling these concepts of the Baal Tanya. They're so excited, so they're very loyal Hasidim, so they buy them. And right away, they start learning it together. And they see obvious mistakes right away in the text. And they're very concerned because they're mistakes that don't reflect well on the Baal Tanya. They make him sound like he was lacking in faith in certain respects. So they right away go to the seller and they say, where did you get these? And they found out that this man who was selling them, it was either him or someone else who was purposely putting mistakes into the text in order to misrepresent who the Baal Tanya was. So they found out that this man had made 600 copies of the manuscript and he had already sold 150. So they go out and they buy 450 left. They buy all of them to make sure that nothing else gets distributed. And they start telling people that this is not what the actual text is. So this, of course, brought about the Tanya, which in ways is so beautiful. It brought about the Alter Rebbe really solidifying what the Tanya is and making sure that it would be published properly without there being any sort of mistakes in the actual text. So just to talk a little bit about the effort that the Alter Rebbe put into the Tanya, this is the one sefer that he wrote and published. He wrote a lot of different svarim. If other people have been coming to the other shirim that I was giving earlier before Tishrei, that was also the Alter Rebbe. However, he didn't actually publish it. That sefer was published after he passed away. Other things that he wrote that are attributed to him, like let's say the Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, he wrote again, but he didn't actually publish it. So this is interesting. He oversaw the publishing and the writing of this. He labored over the Tanya for 20 years. To just give context, I think I could be misquoting, but the Baal Shem Tov, the Alter Rebbe worked on his halacha sefer, which was the Shulchan Aruch Harav. I think he did it within 1 year. It could be that it was a little bit more. I want to get back to, but I think it was over or under a year. The Tanya, which is obviously much smaller, it took him over 20 years. And the extent of thought that he put into the Tanya, I could just share with you over a few different stories. One time his brother walked into the room and saw that the Alter Rebbe had his pen, his quill, poised, and he was thinking, and he was just thinking and thinking. He wasn't moving. And finally, when he finished, the Alter Rebbe noticed that his brother was standing there, the Maharil, and he says, I've been contemplating for 3 weeks whether to put the Vav in right here or not. And it's going to take me another 3 weeks to figure it out. On the 7th, I'll be graced by Hashem with whether or not I should. And the Maharil understood from what the Alter Rebbe, what the Baal Tanya was sharing, was the very specific way the Baal Tanya was investing himself into the Tanya was so perfect that he was doing it even to the letter. Even the letter made a difference. He would contemplate on every single aspect of it. He even told his brother that before he adds anything to the sefer, he reviews the entire thing in his head. So before he writes another idea, he's reviewing the entire Tanya in his head before he actually writes down another idea. So there was an element of a lot of intention in the way that he actually wrote the Tanya. Okay, so before we get into the actual text, I want to talk to you about the 3 different names that it's well known for. The first name that it's most well known for is Tanya. And for those of you who don't even know what Tanya is, Tanya basically means we learn. In Mishnayos, when it says the word Tanya, it means we learn in a brisa. Now, why is it called Tanya? It literally became that name because it starts with that word, Tanya. It basically affectionately became known as that because of the first word. People do say that Tanya is, if you take the letters and you change them around, the word also stands for Eitan, which means strength. And the sefer should be a sefer that gives you the strength to be able to work on yourself, that you should become the person the Alter Rebbe intended for all of us to become, which leads us to the second name, which is Sefer Shel Beinonim, which literally means the sefer for the intermediate. The Alter Rebbe wrote this sefer not for tzaddikim. He actually wrote a sefer shel tzaddikim. It's like a very interesting story. He wrote a sefer for tzaddikim, not for us, for people who never sinned in their lives and never would. And it actually was never learned by anyone. Yeah, what? I was going to say probably not. Did anyone ever learn it? Yeah, so it's a very interesting story. I could tell you, I wasn't going to share this, but He wrote it, and the Shmuel Zayda told him, Shmuel Zayda was a contemporary of the Alter Rebbe, he said, you started to write a sefer that the world cannot accept. It's too much of a revelation of God. So there's an accusation against you if it's actually fully revealed. And it's decreed to be burned. This is what the Shmuel Zayda tells the Baal Tanya. So he kept it basically locked up in a trunk. And it actually happens that the day that the Shmuel Zayda passed away, there was a fire in the Baal Tanya's home, and it was destroyed. And after this happens, the Mittler Rebbe approached the Alter Rebbe approached his son, and he said, do you remember anything from this sefer? Do you remember anything? And the Mittler Rebbe said, I never read it. I never learned it. You said that I shouldn't. And the Alter Rebbe said, where was your Mesiras Nefesh for Chassidus? Basically, why didn't you give up your life to learn this? Obviously, this was precious information. You didn't have Mesiras Nefesh to learn it. But the idea is that this is not a Sefer Shel Tzadikim. It's called Sefer Shel Beinanim, which means it's written for the layman. It's written for me and you. It's written for the person who is constantly in a state of messiness, juggling the humanness and the spirituality that we have all the time. The fact that we're a physical person in a human body, but given a soul, that's who it's talking to, the person who struggles. Chaim Miller wrote a beautiful book about the Tanya, and he calls the Tanya the in-betweener. It's the sefer of the in-betweener, the person who's constantly struggling between, should I attach myself to God more, or should I attach myself to the other, something that doesn't necessarily connect to God? So Sefer Shel Beinanim is the real name for it. It basically fully and most accurately describes what the Tanya is supposed to be. It's written for us, and it's supposed to be very relevant for us. But the name that it's also most popularly known as is Likutei Amarim, which means a collection of sayings or a collection of talks. And that's obviously because the Alter Rebbe started it verbally. He started by speaking it. But not just that, it's a reference to the Baal Tanya's humility, where he's saying it's a collection of discourses. Nothing that I'm sharing here is novel or new. He's basically saying that I am quoting my forebears, my teachers, other Sfarim, and I'm compiling it, right? Likute, which means that it's a gathering. It's like a kuntras, like a gathering, a collection of other people's sayings of what the Torah says in other different places. So he's quoting from lots of different places. Obviously, this is extreme humility, because many of the ideas that the Alter Rebbe brings here, yes, of course, it's sourced in Torah. And he's constantly quoting from Kabbalah and from Torah and from the Gemara and Mishnayos, right? The Mishnah, he starts with Tanya. But the explanation that he offers is novel, because, and this is the way Chassidim often describe the Tanya, they'll say the Baal Shem Tov taught us how we could be connected to God, what we could look like as a Beinani. And in the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe illustrates how we are able to actually live that life. It's literally a workbook on how to grow your midas, how to allow yourself to be more connected to God, to change over your actions so that they're God-oriented instead of self-oriented or ego-oriented. Okay, so it's just important to know those three names really reflect what it ultimately is. Okay, so we'll start with the title page, with which no one has in front of them, but that's okay, because we're just going to do it outside anyway. Important to know that Likutei Amarim, which is the only thing that we're going to be looking at, is 53 chapters. So hopefully we're going to be here for a long time. I'm hoping to do one chapter each time, but we'll see if maybe I could cover more. If I'm just going to go through themes, we'll see how it's going. I'd love to hear the feedback from everybody here. But what's important to know is that Tanya, what is known as a whole, actually has 5 sections. Likutei Amarim is just the first section, and then there's 4 other sections. Those are collections of letters that the Alter Rebbe had with others, with his Chassidim mainly, and other sections. We're going to be focusing on the first 53 chapters. But really, the way the Rebbe says that we should be learning Tanya is we should be starting with the second section, which is called Shar Hayichud Be'amunah, which basically describes the oneness of God and how we are inherently connected to God, and describes how if you contemplate on the oneness of Hashem and you look at the world and all you see is God, then that brings you to a state of deep connection with Him. It brings you to a state of having love and fear of Hashem. So the reason why this is relevant and why I'm talking about it right now is because on the title page, literally before we even start looking at the first parak of Tanya, in the title page, the Alter Rebbe outlines for you what he wants the Tanya to do for you, for his Chassidim, for everybody at large. And he quotes a pasuk from the Torah, which is Ki karev elacha hadavar ma'id beficha ubulvavcha la'asaisei. Right? All of us know this. It's from Devarim. Ki karev elacha hadavar ma'id beficha ubulvavcha la'asaisei. Where is the context of that in the Chumash? Hashem is saying, Moshe Rabbeinu is saying to the Jewish people in Devarim, he's saying that serving Hashem, doing the mitzvahs, is very relevant to you. It's easy to you. It's easy for you to do. It's attainable for you. Okay, kikar v'lecha, it's easy for you. Hadavar ma'id, this thing, serving Hashem, doing mitzvahs. Beficha, to do it in your mouth. Ubabavcha, in your heart. La'asaisei, to do it with your actions. And the way to understand that is the way to serve Hashem, to do mitzvahs, is through your thought, speech, and action. That's how we actually serve God, through those mitzvahs. And it's attainable for you. It's easy for you. And the Alter Rebbe says in the title page, he's quoting this pasuk, and he's saying, I want to make this attainable for you. But for many of us, it doesn't feel attainable. It feels very challenging, right? Specifically, the bilvavcha parts, because in ways, yeah, we do mitzvahs, right? We have a mitzvah of the Yom Tov, we have a mitzvah of the day, we'll shake the lulav and esrog, we'll daven. Even those sometimes are challenging for us. With our mouths, right? Beficha, we try to refrain from speaking Lashon Hara, we try to keep our words truthful, we try to say brachos. It's more attainable. The bilvavcha part is really challenging, and this is where the Baal Tanya is really going to be focusing. And bilvavcha here, the way it's explained and it's understood, is what's in your heart, right? What's your intention? And what Moshe Rabbeinu is telling the Yidden is your intention means that you're serving Hashem with fear and with love, with avas Hashem and with yiras Hashem. Avas Hashem and yiras Hashem are really high levels to attain. Doing a mitzvah, fine, you shake the lulav and esrog, fine, then you did the mitzvah, you did it with your action, you said the bracha, you did it with your mouth. To do it with a love and fear of God is a whole new dimension of serving God. And the question that basically comes up, which is a very famous question, is how are you saying that that's attainable? How are you saying that that's even easy? It's close to you. Doesn't feel like it is. Doesn't feel attainable to me to have a level of avas Hashem and yiras Hashem. It feels very challenging. And the Alter Rebbe says in this title page, which is focal point for the entire Tanya, he says, and now, right, in the next 53 chapters, we are going to outline how this is attainable for you, for the Beinoni, for the person who is the struggler, for the in-betweener, for the person who's dealing with the really messy reality of, I'm in a physical body, I have all the challenges, all the lusts, desires, fears, judgments that come up all the time inside me, that person who's really messy. It is attainable for me to come to a state of avas Hashem, loving God, and yiras Hashem, fearing God. And not just attaining it for like a moment, but actually continuously growing in it. And the Alter Rebbe then says there's 2 different ways of doing it. There's the long, short way and the short, long way. And the whole Tanya, those 53 chapters, are going to explain to us how this is attainable. how it's attainable to gain a love of Hashem and a fear of Hashem, and therefore infuse our physical mitzvahs that we do with our hands and with our mouths, and of course with our whole body, how we can infuse our mitzvahs with a love and fear of God. It's not something remote for just tzaddikim to have kavanais or to have intention or to have connection with God. It's something that we have to strive towards, and it's within our ability. Okay? Any questions so far? Okay, so the long, short way, okay? And he basically talks about it very, very briefly in the beginning, and then he dives into something completely different in Parak Aleph, in the very, very first parak of Tanya. The way he describes it is, the very short way to do that is to uncover something that we already have. So the Alter Rebbe basically starts talking about our neshama, because if we're going to start from anything, we have to start from our identity. And the Alter Rebbe starts with anything actually that people now speak about when they talk about any sort of change or any sort of self-work. It always starts, and you'll hear this or you'll see this in the first chapter of any self-help book. It's all about identity. What do you identify as, right? So talking about the person who wants to go on a diet. They could try to diet as much as they want to change their eating habits, to change the way that they look at food, to limit their calorie counts, to record every single thing that they are eating. It will not have the same effect if they don't start from the beginning and identify themselves as a healthy person, a person who eats healthy. That shift will shift them entirely to an entirely different route in the way that they approach food and the way they approach their life. Am I a healthy person? Yes, because I'm a healthy person, this is what I eat for breakfast. Or I'm a person who's constantly on a diet and I have to limit myself. Really, who am I? I'm a junk food person. That's what I would eat all day. But I have to lose weight. So therefore, I'm going to write down what I'm going to do. I'm going to weigh myself every single day. It's not going to be as effective because your identity is, I'm an unhealthy junk food person. So at any given moment when that habit gives way, you're just going to fall right back to who you really are, that junkie, right? So that's what it speaks about in, let's say, a dieting book and any self-work book. If you're going to identify yourself as a not good person, for example, right, in the realm of psychology, there's the discrepancy between, let's say, Freud and Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, right? So before Viktor Frankl, before the Holocaust, you had Freud. Freud's approach towards humanity was, we are all animals. We are all propelled by our instinct and that very dark place within us, the id, which is completely self-serving. That's what it is. We are all just egotistical and dark people who just we are controlled by our desires and our temptations, and that's who we are. And let's just own up to it. And then there's Viktor Frankl, who, if some of you don't know, Viktor Frankl was a German Jew, which means like the most secular Jew ever. There was nothing Jewish in his life besides for who he was, his neshama, and everything was dictated by reason. And he was a psychologist before the Holocaust. He was in Auschwitz. Man's Search for Meaning. Yeah. And he came out of the Holocaust incredibly, remarkably, thinking that human beings are higher than the way Freud was defining us as. He actually said that people have meaning, people have purpose, people are greater than just their temptation and their lusts. And the reason why he saw that was because he saw that the people who had meaning in the camps were actually able to survive. The people who were only living solely by their ego very quickly died. And it's very interesting. He came out and he read he created logotherapy, and it's incredible. When you look at the two of them and you juxtapose the two of them, what really is the ultimate difference? It's identity. What do I identify myself as? Do I identify myself as an animal who just looks a little bit different than animals? I'm controlled by my instinct and my desire? Or do I identify myself as something that lives according to a higher purpose, that's aware of transcendence, that could care deeply about other people, not in order to serve myself, but because I care about them, right? That concept of living for another. It's a very different identity. And that's really where the Alter Rebbe starts with. So he starts with the long, short way, right? The long way would be to really contemplate on God and foster a deep love and fear of God. And that's going to take years, your whole lifetime, to be able to achieve that. The shorter way is to uncover that we all have an inherent connection to God, and that is our neshama. So he starts with, let's explore, at least in the beginning, our neshama and who that is and what that is. Let's just start right away with what our identity is. And then if we start with identity, from there, our actions will already start changing. If I start looking at myself as someone who identifies as a neshama, then my entire framework of looking at the world is going to change. So that's basically the Alter Rebbe outlining where we're going to be going with this. We're trying to attain mastery over the Beinoni, and we all are the Beinoni. This is a sefer for the Beinoni. What are we supposed to be doing? We're supposed to be trying to serve God. How? Through Avos Hashem and Yiras Hashem. Serving God from a space of loving Him and fearing Him. How do we get to that space? By first looking at, who am I? And he starts looking at the identity of a Jewish person. And that we'll get to, God willing, next class. But just to kind of see what is Tanya and what is it going to bring to our lives, it will practically outline for you how to be someone who is more refined and connected to God. It literally will change the way that you see the world, see others, and see yourself. And that's what the Alter Rebbe was trying to do when he brought the Sefer to the world. He wanted us to identify with our truest part of ourselves, which is our godly spark, not the other parts of ourselves that confuse us, that makes us feel messy and human. He sees those too. Again, the Sefer is written for that person. But first and foremost, we have to identify with, who are we? I am a piece of God. And he starts right away with that and explains that. And we'll get to it, God willing, with the next Sefer, with the next class. Any questions so far? Beautiful. I would love to hear some feedback. First of all, with the pace of the class, if you want it to be a little bit more inside, meaning text-based. If anyone has a takeaway from any of the ideas that we shared here, I'd love to hear that too. I could turn this around to put more pressure. And I know Dina wants more text-based. Yes. Yes.
I think that would be good, but maybe like contracts or where we could write something or like and we have something that. I mean, I could also I could bring my own notes before but I know it'd be hard to do the whole thing text-based.
That's great. So maybe just like the very important phrases, and then like you'll walk away with those phrases. Beautiful. Okay, yeah, I could definitely do that. No, I think it should be okay. Thank you. That's beautiful. How does everyone else feel about that? Like not fully text-based, but like you have a line or just reference for where we're coming from. Yeah, it would help just like basically outline where things are from, especially for the next parak. We're going to need that. Yeah, that's a great idea. Anybody else? Yes.
Basically, like, study is off the table, correct? Like, so I just had a hard time because there's like the Benoni and then the Rasha.
Right.
So the Benoni is like technically the study because the Rasha is like also the average person. I don't know, am I jumping ahead?
You're jumping ahead because that's going to definitely be the next class, and we're going to break down exactly what it like. What do you mean? I always thought that I could be a tzaddik. I definitely thought that I could strive for perfection and show up perfect, and therefore I'm a tzaddikess. And the Alter Rebbe goes into what it actually means to be a tzaddik. But what I'm hearing from you, and this is something that we should really be stressing here, is the Alter Rebbe takes all the terms that you've ever thought of or thought you knew and literally pushes them aside and says, let's start out with completely new terminology here. We're going to start with new language. Tzaddik doesn't mean tzaddik. Beinoni doesn't mean Beinoni. Russia doesn't mean Russia. Good doesn't mean good. Bad doesn't mean bad. He literally takes the things that we stand on, the very foundation, takes the rug, pulls it out from beneath your feet and says, none of that is relevant. All that is relevant is God. And that's the ultimate truth. And then from there, everything is basically up to interpretation, right? And we really know this, but it's hard for us to hold on to it because it feels a lot more stable to kind of know this is good and this is bad, right? And then I can know that this fits into this category and this fits into that category. But the Alter Rebbe throws us into a different space, which is there are no labels. There's just understanding God and trying to get closer to him. And again, there's no good and evil. It's very interesting. There's no bad. It's only what's connected to God and what's disconnected from God. And even the things that are disconnected from God, maybe there's a way of uncovering that it's really ultimately connected to God. So he literally like throws us off. And it's very beautiful because now we could redefine everything and have a focus for how to approach life instead of judging ourselves as today I was good, today I had a bad day, today I had a good day, I'm doing well, I'm not doing well, the extremes that we often put ourselves into and judge ourselves with. And instead, the Alter Rebbe says, Beinoni, you're struggling. That's okay. You're human and you're meant to struggle. That's why you were put here. And you don't have to feel like the tug of I'm good and I'm bad and the ramifications of that, right? So then we punish ourselves more. We go along with, I'll give you an example, right? So if I look at myself and I say, I'm a messy person. So that's how I'm identifying myself. I'm a messy person. So that means that as I'm holding my pajamas, and I have the choice to put them in the hamper or just like throw them on the floor and leave them there, I might just say like, okay, whatever, I'm messy, just leave it there. And then walk past my bed that's not made because it's whatever, that's who I am. Because I'm messy. So like that identity that we have is now forming habits, which further solidifies my identity. And it's like almost like an evil cycle. So instead, the Alter Rebbe introduces the in-between. You're constantly not defining yourself. You're constantly in between. You don't have to be good. You don't have to be evil. You don't have to be messy. You don't have to be neat. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be imperfect. You have to just be. And to embrace that part of yourself, which is really beautiful, instead of the harshness that we usually are dealing with constantly. Anybody else want to share? I love that you're sharing because everything that you're bringing up brings a fine tuning to this class and helps all of us. You're so welcome. Okay, I'm looking forward to starting with this like change it from whatever it is to something else. But I'm deeply humbled and I'm really grateful that we're starting this journey of learning the Tanya. Thank you so much. All the best. Great week. I'm so excited.